Hi guys, and welcome to Cultnomics. My name is Paul Hanley, and today I'm going to be chatting to you about the Laffer Curve and aggregate supply. In this video here, we're going to look at the relationship between taxation in the economy and its impact on tax revenue. And what we'll see is that taxation can impact more variables than aggregate demand. It can also impact on the incentive to work. In order to do this, we'll look at something called a Laffer curve, which has the average tax rate in percentage terms up here on the y-axis, and it has the tax revenue, the tax take down here on the x-axis. We have two extreme points. We have 100% taxation, where the tax take would be zero in this case because there would be no incentive to work whatsoever. So 100% tax but no one working. And we have the other extreme down below with 0% tax, where there would be a massive incentive to work but no take home in terms of tax for the government. So tax revenue would be zero. And the Laffer curve shows the relationship when we move between these tax levels here. So what we'll do is we'll start off with maybe a 10% tax. And in the case of a 10% tax, this is quite low on average. So it wouldn't act as a major disincentive to work, which would mean that the tax revenue taken would be relatively high. However, it is restricted somewhat because the tax level is quite low. So there's a large incentive to work, but the tax revenue based on tax rate is quite low. So let's say 100 billion here. As it goes up, let's say we go up to maybe 40% here. So 40% taxation in this case is getting quite large. The tax rate is quite high, which means the government will be taking in a considerable sum in tax, but it is acting as a disincentive to work. So in that case, we'll say that this is still quite a useful rate of tax for the government in that their tax revenue has increased from its 10% level, and therefore we show it increased along the tax revenue axis here. However, there is a level, and let's say that is 50% in the economy, whereby the tax revenue that's taken by the government is at an optimal level. It's at its highest point. Let's say that that is 300 billion here, and 300 billion is the optimal tax rate in that situation. So what that means, in other words, is that it is the revenue maximizing tax rate. Now, in this situation, if we go beyond this level, so let's say we go up to 70% average tax rate, that would act as such a disincentive to work that even though the rate itself is quite high, with the number of people working, the tax revenue would actually drop from its optimal level. So let's say it drops down to our 200 billion again here. So the quite high tax level is causing a disincentive to work in that scenario. And we can go up to maybe 90% here as well, where there's a major disincentive to work, and say that this causes tax revenue to fall even further down to, in this situation here, maybe let's say 40 billion. Now, what we have is a series of points on our Laffer curve, and if we are to join up these points from 0 all the way up to our 10% level, and straight up here to our 40% level, onto our optimal, and then back around because of the disincentive, and back here to our 90%, and back around again. What we have is a Laffer curve, which is showing a optimal rate of taxation, which is quite hard to figure out for an economy. And beyond this level, there is a disincentive to work, so much so that the actual tax revenue is falling, even though the tax rate is increasing. So a Laffer curve is a backward bending curve in this scenario, looking for an optimal level of taxation. We can translate this over to the left-hand side, where we have, for example, a long-run aggregate supply curve. So we'll go long-run aggregate supply here. We have an aggregate demand curve as well, and we're going to say that this aggregate demand curve is quite low at the minute. So we'll say AD is over to the left of long run aggregate supply, and we'll also say that the short run aggregate supply curve is over to the left as well. So what this means from earlier videos is that we have a output gap in the economy, we have a recession gap in this case here at point A, where we have a price level P1 and we have a GDP level that is below the optimal or potential. So GDP1 is below its potential level here. Now, a tax reduction, according to the supply siders, if the tax rate is too high, let's say up at 70% here, if it's too high and the government reduce the tax rate, it can have two effects in our economy. One effect is, and we know this from before, that aggregate demand may increase. So what we have in this situation is if the aggregate demand curve increases, we have a point over here on our graph where the aggregate demand curve increases, shifts to the right. So we have AD1 in this scenario, but also the supply siders would argue that if you drop the tax rate from 70% here down to 50, you're going to provide an incentive to work. Price expectations may drop as well. In that scenario, you have a positive impact on short-run aggregate supply as well, and therefore we shift our short-run aggregate supply curve to the right. And in that scenario, we have short-run aggregate supply 1. We have a new equilibrium point in this case here, and the GDP level has increased substantially. It's closed up that output gap in the economy. The price level has stayed roughly the same, and the output level has increased considerably from a demand side effect and from an equally important, if not more important, sometimes supply side impact. I hope you call back to Cultnomics soon. Bye for now.